Hello, my name is Chloe Benoit, and I'm going to be presenting on violent video games and their influence on laws and regulations. So, to start off, or to give some background, the current debate I'm going to be discussing is on whether or not violent video games have harmful effects on children and adolescents. And so, for decades, lawmakers, researchers, and other professionals have debated over this topic. And because of this, there's been a lot of research that has been conducted over the years in an attempt to try and provide some clarity on this topic of debate. Um, However, the results of these research studies have been controversial or have provided data that has supported both sides of this controversial debate. So, to give an example of this, there's a research study done by Zhang et al. 2021 that data from the study indicated that the participants, the children who played and observed violent video games in this study, displayed both more aggressive cognitions and aggressive behaviors than those participants that played non-violent video games. And so, data like this that shows an increase in aggression can provide support to the position that, yes, violent video games do have harmful effects on children and adolescents. Controversially, in the study performed by Ferguson and Rueda 2010, the results of this study um, indicated that the children or the participants' aggressive behavior was not affected by the level of violence in the video games that they played. And as well, the violent video games did not have an effect on the hostile feelings or depressive feelings of these children. And so data like this provides support to the side of the argument or the debate that violent video games are not having harmful effects on children and adolescents. And so, going off both of these positions, how can influence from either side of this debate be seen in legislation today? So, you can see some influence from the side that does not believe that violent video games are having harmful effects. From one large part of this is there's a lack of federal laws in place currently that prohibit minors from purchasing violent video games. There are no federal laws in place, nor are there any state laws currently in place that do this. And the reason for this is because of a ruling by the Supreme Court, Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association. And essentially, in the Supreme Court case, there was a California bill signed in by the California governor at the time that was prohibiting the sale of violent video games to minors. And the Supreme Court ruled that this California bill was unconstitutional because it violated the children's freedom of speech that's given to them in the First Amendment. And essentially, the Supreme Court essentially said that the state of California, in the court case, had failed to provide a compelling government interest to justify the restrictions of speech in the bill. And so, essentially, from this, the Supreme Court is saying, had said they did not see evidence of enough harmful effects that violent video games are having on children and adolescents to be able to, again, restrict their freedom of speech and being able to communicate their ideas and messages in these games. On the other side of the debate, you can see some influence in legislation. On the side of the debate that's saying violent video games do have harmful effects on children and adolescents. Again, going back to these state bills, although they're not currently in place, before the Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association, a lot of states in the United States had tried to pass laws to, again, regulate the sale of violent video games to minors. So that's one way you can see this influence from this side of the debate. Another way is because currently in the video game industry, you're seeing a lot of self-regulation by these manufacturers and retailers of these violent video games. For example, the ESRB, or the Entertainment Software Rating Board, is currently a very large self-regulating board for the video game industry. And what this company does is they review video games and they provide an age rating for these games. And so a lot of times when you go to buy games, you'll see the letter E for everyone, or you'll see a rating that's M for mature or adults only. And so this company is basing these ratings. A large part of it is based on the amount of violence within these video games. And so, again, receiving a rating by the ESRB is completely voluntary. These video game manufacturers and retailers are not legally mandated to get these ratings and advertise them. However, if they do decide to go through the ESRB and get these ratings, the ESRB has contracts with these companies that restricts how these games are labeled. So if they give them a rating, they are required by their contract to display that rating on these games when they sell them, and then these contracts are also restrict how these companies are advertising these games. So the ESRB will actually give penalties to these companies if they advertise mature rated games, say with a lot of violence, to minors or children. And so, what are some possible future implications from the side of the debate that believes, yes, violent video games are having harmful effects on children and adolescents? So, one possible implication is that there may be a future Supreme Court ruling down the line to overturn their ruling of Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association. So, if there is enough evidence to support that these these violent video games are having harmful effects and it's endangering, children or society, if some of these harmful effects, again, referring back to those studies earlier, are causing children to have increased aggression and aggressive behaviors and violence, then they may say that these harmful effects on society and children are justified enough to allow these bills to go through that are prohibiting or restricting the sale of violent video games to minors. Another possible future implication is the implementation of both federal and state laws, possibly that, again, are going to regulate the sale of violent video games to minors, whether that be laws that prohibit minors from purchasing these violent video games altogether, or there may be laws that regulate them where these children are able to purchase these games, but only, let's say, with um, a guardian present or guardian's permission. There may also be a shift from video game manufacturers and retailers voluntarily submitting games to receive ratings by the ESRB or other self-regulatory video game companies. So you may see a shift from them voluntarily doing this to being legally mandated to do so. So again, federal and state laws may be implemented that require these video game manufacturers and the retailers of these games to receive these ratings so that society is aware of things like the amount of violence in these games before they buy them. Um, there may also, going off of this shift, there may be further laws put in place that prohibit these manufacturers and retailers of violent video games, that prohibit them from submitting deceptive content to the ESRB. So they have to submit accurate content so that they can give accurate ratings. There may also be laws that prohibit these companies from marketing the game as, a rating other than what's given to them by the ESRB. So if that board or another regulatory board gives them a rating, let's say M for mature, so these children have to be 18 or older because of the violence in the game, then these companies would not possibly be able to, they'd be penalized for um, marketing these games as another rating, such as E10 plus, so everyone 10 and older. There may also possibly laws that prohibit these manufacturers and retailers from inappropriately advertising mature rated games to minors. And then there may also be, if these say there are no federal or state laws being implemented um, based on this position that prohibit minors from purchasing these games altogether, they may implement policies that limit the amount of time that these minors are actually allowed to play these violent video games. So, let's say the consoles that these children are playing violent video games on, these companies that make these consoles may have to, upgrade their technologies to be able to have features that say cut off the children and lock them out of playing a violent video game for a set period of time. And finally, what are some possible future implications that can be influenced by the position that no, violent video games are not having harmful effects on children and adolescents. So there's a possibility that because of the ruling of the Supreme Court mentioned earlier, that if states are still trying to pass these bills and these laws that are regulating the sale of violent video games to minors, these state bills may continue to be overturned and ruled unconstitutional. And therefore, there will continue to not be any laws and regulations on the sale of violent video games. There may also be a cease altogether of these state legislators trying to introduce bills, not only bills that possibly prohibit the sale of violent video games to minors, but bills that are targeting violent video games in general or their developers. So, for example, if they're not able to prohibit the sale, they may be making policies that possibly increase taxes on the purchase of violent video games, or increase taxes for developers when making these games. So you may see a cease altogether. Again, if they're believing that there's not harmful effects, if they believe that violent video games are not having harmful effects on children and adolescents, these legislators may not push anymore for bills to target violent video games. Another possible implication is there may be a repealment of laws and regulations in other countries that currently have restrictions on the sale of violent video games to minors. So, although the US does not have any laws and regulations, other countries currently do, again, that regulate the sale of violent video games. And so, if they believe that there are not harmful effects, then they may, again, repeal these laws or possibly make the penalties less severe. You may also possibly see a decreased number of video game manufacturers and retailers that are voluntarily self-regulating their sales and advertisements. So again, the ESRB is a very popular and used regulatory company by a lot of these large video game manufacturers and retailers. And so if society and these retailers and manufacturers are no longer, being influenced that video games are having harmful effects, then they may no longer feel obligated to get these ratings by the ESRB or sign these contracts where they can possibly, face fines and penalties for going against the ESRB's regulations. And then finally, the ESRB again has contracts, individual contracts with these companies, even though there are no federal or state laws. Again, the ESRB has these contracts with these companies. When they get ratings by them, they basically fine them for advertising games with mature ratings and a lot of violence to minors. And so, if the ESRB and society is taking a stance that violent video games are not having harmful effects on children and adolescents, then the ESRB could possibly amend their contracts to allow manufacturers and retailers to be able to advertise these violent video games to all ages, minors and children, and then let parents decide whether or not they're going to allow these children to play these games. And here are my references, and I thank you for watching my presentation.